So with the rumors of Errol Spence leapfrogging Terence Crawford and getting the Sebastian Fundora fight, a lot of people have been discussing and going back and forth on who is the bigger name and the bigger star between Terence Crawford and Errol Spence. And I decided to weigh in on this discussion, and I want to make it very clear and very obvious my view and my stance on that. And I believe it's very obvious and very clear that Terence Crawford has surpassed Errol Spence, not just as a fighter, as we all saw on July 29th, but has surpassed Errol Spence as a name and as a star of the sport. Now, for a long time, there's been a narrative that Errol Spence was a bigger name than Terence Crawford. Now, I do believe there's some truth to this. I do believe that for a decent amount of time, Errol Spence was probably a little more known than Terence Crawford. I don't know why that must be happening once a video, my mic falling over. A little more known than Terence Crawford. I don't think he was ever much bigger than Crawford, but I will acknowledge he was always a little more known than Crawford. And there's a few reasons for this. You can argue he was marketed better. He represents Texas while Crawford represents Nebraska, so he automatically has a much bigger demographic of supporters, I would say, due to the fact that his state of Texas was heavily behind him, while Nebraska has nowhere near as many people. Spence has been on more pay-per-views, I believe. And I just think overall Spence was just a little more known than Crawford. He wasn't way more known than Crawford. He wasn't way more famous than him, but he was more known. However, I think it's very obvious and very apparent that after Terence Crawford's absolute domination and very, very great beatdown of Errol Spence, that he is a bigger name than Errol Spence at this point. And there's a lot of evidence behind this. First of all, Terence Crawford has 500,000 more followers than Errol Spence on Instagram. Now, a lot of people will say, oh, by that logic, Ryan Garcia or Anthony Joshua or Canelo Alvarez. First of all, Canelo Alvarez and Anthony Joshua are obviously arguably more of the face of boxing than Terence Crawford. We're not comparing Crawford and Canelo or Crawford and AJ. If you look at someone like Ryan Garcia, who has more followers than Crawford and Spence combined, Ryan Garcia has a lot of followers not due to boxing. Most of his followers actually are due to him being internet famous outside of the sport of boxing. He's known amongst younger teens and kids and young adults, not through fighting specifically. So when it comes to Ryan Garcia having more followers than them, that doesn't mean he's more of the face of boxing than they are. The reason that Crawford having more followers than Spence matters is because these two guys are literally only known as boxers. Crawford is not famous in any other regard, and Errol Spence is not famous in any other regard. They are both known as fighters. So if Crawford has more fans than Spence on social media across multiple platforms, not just Instagram, he also has more on Twitter. If he's more known than Errol in multiple aspects, it has to do with him being a more known fighter, not a more known celebrity. So Crawford being bigger than Errol Spence, and this doesn't have to do with size, by the way. I know the title might confuse some people. Oh, Crawford's a bigger fighter than Errol Spence. He weighs more than him on the scale. No, that's not what I'm referencing. I'm talking about pulling power and what they bring in. Because a lot of people are saying that Sebastian Fundora should fight Errol Spence due to the fact that Spence is a bigger name than Crawford. I find that laughable. First of all, Errol Spence was not even that much of a bigger name than Crawford when they were both undefeated. Errol Spence was slightly more known, but it was very close. After Crawford absolutely demolished him and gave him a complete beatdown, Terence Crawford became a much bigger name than Errol Spence. He's much more known than Errol Spence now. He's much more talked about than Errol. The only time Errol really gets brought up now is being Terence Crawford's best win. That's what Errol really gets referenced. And people will say, oh, Crawford's only really big now and famous now because of Errol. Yes, it may have been because of Errol that Crawford is getting a lot of notoriety, but he has surpassed Errol at this point. He's a bigger name than Errol Spence. He's a bigger draw and a bigger star. You're telling me that more people will tune into an Errol Spence fight than a Terence Crawford fight in 2024? At this point of their careers, after what Crawford did to Errol, more people would tune into an Errol Spence event, an Errol Spence fight, over a Terence Crawford one. That's not the case anymore. I'm sorry to all the Errol Spence fans that this offends. I'm actually not sorry. Why would I be sorry, right? I'm sorry to break it to you that Terence Crawford is a much bigger name than Errol Spence at this point. Maybe not much, but decently bigger name than Errol. Errol has pretty much fallen off since the Crawford loss, actually. I know this might sound a little harsh, but it's the truth. Since the Crawford fight, Spence has not been rumored to fight almost anyone. Now he's being rumored to fight Fundora because he weaseled his way back into the picture. But prior to that, he was pretty much AFK for 7 months, nearly 8 months straight of nothing, silence. I would say, yeah, it was 8 months straight, because after July 29th to March 30th, that's an 8-month period of Errol Spence completely falling basically off the face of the earth when it comes to the sport of boxing. And Crawford just got bigger and bigger and bigger. There was rumors of him fighting Canelo Alvarez, him getting big fights in Saudi Arabia. It seems that Crawford does have more backing from the Saudis than Errol does as well. So there's multiple proof. I know that sounded wrong. There's a lot of proof, that's how I should say it, that Terence Crawford has surpassed Errol as a name. He's a bigger draw than Errol. He's a bigger money fight than Errol Spence. This notion that Spence is a bigger money fight than Terence Crawford, that he's a bigger name than Crawford, it has to die off already because it's been debunked multiple times. And I'm not the type of guy that likes talking about who the A side should be or who the B side should be, the splits for fights. I never made a video discussing Shakur Stevenson and Devin Haney, 75-25, all that stuff. I'm not a guy who's big on that. But the fact that this is such a laughable debate, it's so obviously one-sided, and the fact that there are actually people claiming that Errol's a bigger name than Crawford and claiming that he's a bigger fight and for Fundora than Crawford, and people using this as a tactic for Crawford to get screwed over and for Errol Spence to leapfrog him and get this title shot over Crawford. It's very wrong. It's very unjust. The fact that Errol Spence has a chance of getting this fight over Crawford is very unfair when he literally just got dominated by Crawford, got dropped 4 times and stopped and saved by the ref. If the ref didn't jump in, it probably would have been a brutal KO in the next round or so. It was a really one-sided victory for Crawford, as we all know, and Errol Spence is not on the same tier as Crawford anymore. Crawford has separated himself from Errol. They've always been synonymous with each other. They've always been guys that have, if you bring up Crawford, you bring up Spence. You bring up Spence, you bring up Crawford. It's always been a fight where people have viewed as the main legacy fight for both fighters, and they've always been viewed in a very similar tier. Crawford was always a little above Errol when it comes to the fans' perception of their abilities. But even in that aspect of Crawford only being slightly above Errol Spence at the time, at this point, Crawford is noticeably better than Errol as a fighter, and he's noticeably higher than Errol Spence when it comes to marketing and drawing power. I mean, Crawford and Canelo might be the biggest fight in the entire sport that could get made, honestly, for being objective. And Errol Spence at this point, he just does not have that same draw because we all saw Errol Spence get exposed by Crawford. We all saw that he is not on that level. Crawford's the best fighter in the world as far as I'm concerned. Errol Spence is not there. Crawford has heavily surpassed him in followers. Errol Spence used to have more followers than Crawford on Instagram before they fought. I always remember him having about 50 to 60K more than Crawford. It's a weird stat that I know, but I always used to check on that type of stuff because I was always curious. And now Crawford has 500,000 more than Errol. So I understand people saying, oh, look at the pay-per-view numbers, look at the live gate numbers. Errol Spence is statistically a bigger fighter than Terence Crawford. But times change. Times change. Crawford doing what he did to Errol has made him bigger than Errol. I bet for future fights that both have, Crawford will generate more. He'll be a bigger draw and a bigger attraction. Times change. Statistically, Errol's a bigger fighter than Crawford, but since all of those stats are prior to their fight against each other, they're basically invalid in my opinion. You guys let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. If you disagree with me, let me know why. I personally genuinely feel that Crawford has made it very clear that he's the bigger name than Errol Spence, and because of that fact, he deserves to have much more bargaining power. I don't know, my mouse isn't working. He deserves to have much more bargaining power and much more leverage than Spence. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, though. Have a good one, guys. God bless. I'll see you guys later. Peace.